We connected over our appreciation of the mid 20th century architectural style called Googie. What do you feel is most misunderstood about Googie?
Ah, interesting. I was just talking with some friends who are scholars and academics about that very issue. Um, and I think it comes down to basically that Googie was democratic. It was for everyone. It brought modernism within the reach of anybody with the price of a hamburger in their pocket that they could pay for. So it a couple of things came from that. It was so colorful and it was varied, and also it was um, related to organic architecture, the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. Um, and while Wright was accepted, the spin-offs from Wright, people influenced by Wright, were not always given the same respect in architecture circles as, for example, the international style, um, which had plenty of academic validation, books and symposiums and exhibits. And this is going back to the 1930s and well into the 60s and 70s. Um, it was just a more acceptable style for critics and mainstream historians. And Googie was just a little too popular, a little too commercial, which in many ways disqualified any example of architecture in the eyes of certain critics. Now, well, hopefully, with the appreciation for Googie today that you show, and many others as well, we've maybe gotten over that hump and can consider Googie as true and real and valid architecture because it is. It definitely is.
I saw a video from you about the architecture of Las Vegas, and what really struck me was your comment about Googie architecture being a type of modernism, but not from Europe or the factory. Instead, it's from the West, America, and is mainly based in pleasure. One of my favorite descriptions of Googie architecture is that it has a carnival like atmosphere.
Yeah, but carnivals, can be architecture also. You think of the great World's Fairs, the 1893 Chicago Fair, uh, which was a great fair, but it had the White City, which was classical and very acceptable at the time. But it had the Midway also, which had just an incredible carnival atmosphere. But it included, the incredible innovation of the Ferris wheel, which was such a symbol of, the modern era. Um, this whole, multi-story building, steel structure that turned, it moved. I mean, it was just an amazing sight to people there. So I accept the carnival comparison.
Why is Googie important? Why is it worth preserving?
Well, from a scholarly academic point of view, Googie represents a period of time and the people using the buildings and the cultural and social trends of the time. Um, and so, as part of our history of who we were, what we were like, what we appreciated, uh, Googie is just one of the best examples of that from that time period when it was most popular. Beyond that, of course, though, our cities thrive on variety and diversity. And that's to me, as an architect involved with historic preservation, one of the most important things for the health of a city, the vitality of the city, the enjoyment of the city, to have all historic styles and types of buildings represented. So you don't just wipe out a whole era because you're on to a new one. The cities that people go to, San Francisco, New York, Paris, Rome, um, all of these are popular and have an economic value, of course, for tourism because they have such a variety. So that's another argument for saving Googie, I think.
Thank you.
This isn't limited to just Googie, but what do you feel have been some of our greatest architectural losses of late?
Okay, well, I'll get there are a lot. There are too many. But one of my favorite to point out right now, because of I'm working on a large research project on William Pereira
Mhm.
and the loss of the Los Angeles County Museum of Art in Los Angeles on Wilshire Boulevard uh, uh, to be replaced uh, for a new museum, an entirely new building, which is now under construction. I think it's going to open sometime later this year, semi-officially. But it was such an outdated approach to a civic monument. Um, you know the history of historic preservation in places in Los Angeles like Bunker Hill, which was a Victorian house neighborhood. And back in the 50s and 60s, it was decided to just tear that all down, wipe it off the face of the earth, and build new buildings, including the new music center and so forth at the time. But that was such today we see that that is an outdated approach to urban development and design. Um, and that, unfortunately, is exactly what the LA County Museum of Art decided to do. They just wiped out a whole set of buildings. It was a whole complex of buildings. Um, and to replace them with a brand new shiny building, which will get a lot of attention, no question at all. But a much more appropriate approach, I think, for the 21st century is adaptive reuse, is saving buildings that can be saved, adapted, added to as necessary, updated in terms of equipment and so forth, to be practical and functional for today. Uh, that to me is the modern, or for today, the best approach to urban redevelopment or how do you treat historic buildings. And instead, they chose a 60-year-old philosophy of just wipe it out and build something new, and that's the way we should progress. I simply don't agree with that.
I agree. There have been too many historic downtowns in America lost to that exact attitude. Have you met any of the famous Googie architects like Paul Revere Williams or Helen Lu Fong?
Yes, it's one of the most satisfying parts of what I do in my research and writing. I started researching Googie in the early 1980s
Mhm.
and started with Eldon Davis of Army and Davis.
Mhm.
And I met Helen Fong, who worked with Army and Davis at that time, but also Martin Stern Jr., who designed ships in Westwood and Culver City and La Cienega, um, another great Googie architect. And just getting to know them, being able to talk to them, they were all kind of shocked that I was interested because they were straight commercial architects. They had clients and they served the clients, but they did it with such inventiveness and appropriateness. And as we now realize, something very special about their talent and their place and the time and the type of building and so forth. But they were, most of them anyway, very willing to talk about what it was, and they were a little curious why I was interested. But no, they were really interesting people, and especially now, Helen Fong um, is getting more attention because very in a very interesting way. She was a woman. She was an Asian American woman, and she didn't get a lot of attention. She got, had a career, but she's getting more attention because we realize the importance of recognizing those sorts of figures today.
Yes, I believe there have been several podcasts and articles published about her recently.
But
Yes, and also a group of students at the Princeton School of Architecture is planning a symposium focused on her um, sometime soon, the next couple of months.
oh, that's great.
Who inspires you most as a historian?
Oh, they're just people that, I couldn't have done half of what I've done if they had not had incredible careers before. I think very much of Esther McCoy. Have you ever read Esther McCoy's?
Haven't.
Oh, you have to. Five California Architects in 1960. She was here in Los Angeles. And the five architects were Bernard Maybeck, Irving Gill, Rudolph Schindler, and the Green brothers. And all of those people in 1960 were forgotten.
Mm,
They've been written off, including Rudolph Schindler. Um, if it had not been for her writing about Schindler, that started the appreciation of him and saving his archives, understanding. And today he's one of the major architectural heroes
okay.
of the modern movement. But we would not know about him at all. We would have lost his buildings and his archives if Esther McCoy had not written that book. And she very, very readable style as well. Very simple, crisp, and I like to, I try to emulate that when I can. The other person I'd like to mention, though, is David Gebhardt,
Mhm.
who was the archivist and professor at University of California, Santa Barbara. And again, about the same time, around in the 60s, 70s, 80s, he sought out the archives of architects that nobody cared about. And he saved them at UC Santa Barbara. And today, that is just a treasure trove, so valuable to me and to many, many architectural historians. He was again help. He was one who did a lot to save the Schindler archives, but also Irving Gill, and we would have lost these people completely from history. It's always frustrating when you're doing research and you call up and ask if so and so is still around, and they died the week before I called. That's happened to me, unfortunately, a couple of times. It's very frustrating.
A complaint I hear frequently from my audience about architecture made today is that it looks ugly and soulless. What advice would you give to architecture students today so that their work isn't perceived that way?
Hmm. What would be an example of what they think is ugly?
Like 5/1 apartment buildings or new commercial architecture like a McDonald's.
Yeah, yeah. Um, well, first of all, I would warn people to be very careful because again, Googie at one point was considered just completely disposable. Get rid of it. It's ugly. The cycles of what is considered ugly. I mean, and every major style, the Craftsman bungalow, Art Deco, modernism itself, the Googie certainly. went through this cycle where it was accepted and then it went out of fashion, and we lost so many examples. But then inevitably, there's return to appreciate what it was all about. So I don't know. First of all, I would just give the advice to step back. Robert Venturi had the great advice of suspending judgment on architecture that you may think you don't like. Give it some time to think about it, and you might see something. Now, that stated, yes, a lot of commercial architecture these days is very bland. It's not exciting. It makes no effort to try something new or appropriate for our times. Um, so what do you do about that? Um, Man, again, as a historian, I think you just look at history. Um, there's so much rich architecture to inspire architects today. We need to know that history. We need to know architects. Again, I've written about them in a couple of my books. Architects who were completely forgotten, architects who actually didn't try to get to be famous. Um, and but did incredible, inspiring, innovative work. So seek those out. They're in every city. Every city has interesting architects in its past, and we need to know who those are and document them, take pictures of their buildings, save their archives, all that sort of thing.
Although you're known for your work on 20th century architecture, what older styles or architects do you particularly appreciate?
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm very eclectic. I just like good architecture, whatever style it is. Um, uh, Sir John Soane, English architect from 19th century, I guess. Um, uh, Sort of classical. I mean, he was in the era of research about Greek and Roman architecture, but what he did with it was just remarkable. Also English, Christopher Wren, who did St. Paul's Cathedral, but so many really daring neighborhood churches as well. Um, he wasn't just repeating what had gone before, but he was taking those ideas and doing something new with them, I guess. And that's something that I've always enjoyed. And then, I remember several years ago, I was in the Yucatan and went to some of the Mayan ruins, their pyramids, just, you know, so striking, just so impressive. Um, Oh, or Machu Picchu, for heaven's sakes. It was a magical place, um, really capturing its site, very dramatic site on top of these cliffs overlooking a river valley. And the way that they put together these huge, I mean, these were stones, boulders, literally the size of a car or a truck, and they fitted them together